All right, we're joined by Taylor McHargue of ESPN, CBS Sports, color analyst. Thank you, Taylor, for being a part of it. Good to have you. By the way, nice win for Rice against the Midshipmen. Yeah, how about that? What were your thoughts when you saw, which is the first of a handful, of the release of the college football standings?
Well, I thought for the top four, by and large, I thought it was about what we expected. I thought the disrespect for Indiana is probably what jumped out most to me. If you take Michigan's helmet and you swap out those decals, I think that is a top five team in Indiana. And I understand the argument that they haven't played anybody, right? But for the teams that they have played, I thought Joel Klatt from Fox did a great job of mapping this out from a year ago, what Michigan's resume looked like and what their schedule looked like to this point in the season versus what Indiana's looks like to this point in the season. It's not all about who they've played. It's also how they've played. And I think they've been dominant in specific spots. I think about how they looked against Nebraska. Then Nebraska turns around and goes and gives Ohio State all they can handle, beat Washington playing with your backup quarterback. Now, the good news for Indiana is you're going to get a pretty clear answer in 2 weeks when they have to go to Ohio State. And that matchup is going to tell us a lot about, is this Hoosiers team for real? I think if that is a one-score game in any direction, obviously if they win, but if they lose that by a score or less, to me, this becomes a playoff team. And I think if they sit there at 11-1, they don't make the they don't make the Big Ten championship, but they're sitting there at 11-1 and their one close loss is to Ohio State. I think that is a playoff team, and I think that's my biggest takeaway from the initial rankings.
Taylor, do you see a path more reasonably for the Big 12 or ACC to get two teams?
I think it's at this point, it's probably the ACC. I think about if you end up with SMU and Miami in their ACC championship, if SMU loses that game close and BYU ends up winning the Big 12, and your two losses, if you're SMU, are the conference champion from the Big 12 that's now in the playoff, and Miami, who also may end up having the Heisman Trophy winner, I think SMU actually has a better shot at getting in as an at-large bid than Iowa State would. And this is assuming, again, that BYU beats Iowa State. Now, if you end up with one loss BYU, one loss Iowa State, and SMU were to lose handily to Miami, then I think obviously that becomes a different story. But the Big 12, if you just go down the line throughout the season, and we've talked a lot about this through the offseason, this was the concern with the Big 12. It's been the case with the Big 12 in the past. It's a conference that cannibalizes itself. And if you go through the season, how many times have we seen spreads be 2.5 points, 3 points, 3.5 points? And there's so much balance in this league, and that's why you end up at the end of the season where if you got really anybody can beat anybody for the most part. There's a couple teams at the bottom that you don't really count. I think it hasn't been great for the Big 12 by and large that the favorites coming into the season have underperformed dramatically. Obviously, Kansas, Oklahoma State. I think that's been one of the biggest disappointments of the entire season. And I think, TCU Baylor last week was a great example of this league, right? Where if you play that game 10 times, that may go 5-5. And if you play that on the road, it's still probably a one-score game for whoever has to be on the road. I thought that was really indicative of what this league is. But as it plays out and because of that parity, I think the Big 12 is going to struggle to get two teams in.
Taylor, with BYU, I mean, they control their own destiny. I know last night they see the 8 or 9 pop up, but they'll be a 4 with a bye. Like, they just need to keep winning games, I think, is the basic message. You can feel a little bit of pressure, though, because you're clearly not being eyed the same way as other unbeaten teams. So just looking at BYU, is it all about just locking in and just winning everything in front of you, and as simple as that, or is there more to it than just that?
I think there might be more to it as well, because there's a couple opportunities in their schedule the rest of the way where you do not, if you're BYU, you don't want to give the committee any excuse if they end up losing the Big 12 championship to Iowa State. And what I mean by that is, they've got games against some of the teams in the bottom of the league through the rest of the slate. They've got Arizona State, they've got Houston, they've got Kansas. They need to win those convincingly. And I think you could make the case for Iowa State as well. How you play in these games matters. But for BYU, this is a team that They remind me in some cases a lot of what Indiana has done as well. They've snuck up on everybody, and their margin for victory has been a lot stronger in some cases than I think what Iowa State's has been, especially in key games. And that win on the road earlier in the season against SMU for BYU, that's gotten stronger as the year has gone along as well. But I think this is the time of year for BYU. Style points. If they win out, obviously they control their own destiny. It doesn't matter if they win all of these games by 1 point. But if they were to, you're trying to pad your stats, so to speak, so that if in the event they lose to Iowa State, and that's who we're assuming, I keep saying Iowa State, it may be Colorado, the way that they're playing. Regardless, for BYU, they need to be in a position where they can point back to some style points against the bottom of the league. They don't want any of these games close against like a Houston or a Kansas.
But if BYU was to lose and not win the championship, SMU doesn't need that because they beat SMU straight up, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And for SMU, it's funny, when they lost that game earlier in the season, if you remember, SMU had played Nevada in week 0 close, and then they lose to a BYU team that was picked in the bottom of the league. And that was the part of the season where we're all saying, okay, they weren't ready for the ACC, and it was hold your horses, let's wait a little bit. And then obviously a dominant win against what was an undefeated Pitt team at the time. So it's been really impressive what Brett Lashley and that team have accomplished to this point in the season. But you're exactly right. With BYU, SMU has that tiebreaker ultimately over BYU. Again, for SMU, they just don't need to be in a position where they get blown out by a Miami. That's the only case that I could see. That would put the committee in a predicament if you're having to, you go head to head, and SMU did beat BYU. But if they look ugly at the end of the year, I think that's where it starts to get a little bit muddy, even though they would have had the head to head.
This week, Georgia and Ole Miss. If Ole Miss loses, they're out. If they win, they're re-solidifying who they are. Georgia's been bad, by their standards. Carson Beck's been throwing interceptions all over the place. Do you think it shifts Georgia's narrative too much if they lose?
I would say Georgia hasn't been bad. I would say Carson Beck's been bad. And I think about the Texas game where Georgia's defense, I thought for the entire season, if you ask me to put, what's the most impressive performance by any one side of the ball all season, I think it's Georgia's defense against Texas. Just absolutely dominant. Their plan to get after Quinn Ewers and make him uncomfortable was fantastic. The only reason that game was close was because Carson Beck had the early interceptions. And that's continued. And the 3 interceptions that he had against Florida, what stands out to me just seems like a loss of confidence. Some of these throws, these are open windows. It's not like he's getting hit, he's under duress, or he's missing reads. He knows where to go with the ball. Some of these are just not finishing throws, and that's what I'm looking for against Ole Miss, because if Georgia, this is the type of opportunity where if he turns the ball over against Ole Miss and their offense is in any sort of rhythm, this is especially since this is being played at Ole Miss, this is absolutely a game that Ole Miss can win. And you said it exactly right. This now vaults them right back into the conversation for, okay, is this potentially an at-large team? For Georgia, it's also the opportunity, if they can figure out these issues on offense and play a cleaner brand of football, this is the type of win where if they go, and it seems like every time Georgia's in a big spot on the road, Kirby Smart figures out a way to just get the most out of his guys. This is another great example of an opportunity for that. And if they come out and win by multiple scores and they're dominant, then I think it further solidifies Georgia. And I don't want to make too much of it. This is still one of the best teams in college football. It may end up being the best team in college football, but they've got to have better play out of Carson Beck.
The big noon kickoff game out in Lubbock, Texas Tech coming off of a nice bounce-back win, taking down Iowa State in Ames, and number 20 Colorado. You mentioned the Buffaloes kind of being right there in that mix for the Big 12 still. Any thoughts on Deion and company heading out to West Texas?
Well, first off, unbelievable win for Joey McGuire and Texas Tech. I mean, as you guys know, Baylor had gone up and beaten them recently, and that was – I don't think there's any question that was the biggest win to this point in the Joey McGuire era at Tech. Colorado just keeps winning. And I go back to I think it started, this may have been 5 or 6 weeks ago now, but I believe it was the first league game where Colorado goes on the road to Central Florida, and I thought Central Florida would win that game outright. And that was the first time that we saw a physicality on the defensive side specifically for Colorado, and they have not let that up. That's carried through up to this point in the season. Huge game. Obviously, it'll be an early kick for Colorado. It'll feel like 10 a.m., but just the hour difference. But regardless, it's an early kick. I think for Colorado, now you start to really begin that conversation. If they win this game against Texas Tech, and it's sort of already happening, but that conversation about this being a legitimate threat in not only to make the playoffs, but to win games in the playoffs. I think there's a key difference there. That starts to become very real if they beat the Red Raiders.
It seems like when there's a conference like the Big 12 and maybe the ACC with Clemson, okay, Florida State's disappeared, but those two conferences, when maybe others eat each other or cannibalize each other, we hear that in those two conferences. Why don't we hear that much in the SEC or the Big Ten when they do it?
Well, part of it now is obviously the teams that have been added, right? You've taken for the Big Ten, for example, Oregon now gets counted in the Big Ten. Indiana, I keep going back to that. Indiana is a great example of a team that's sort of been able to hide because the leagues are so big now that you have certain teams where the strength of schedule it ends up they just play more of the bottom end of the league than the top. It's harder to find parity. But I think if you look at power ratings, the ACC and the Big 12, if you go from the middle of the pack down, is weaker than the middle of the pack down in the Big 10 and the SEC. Now, I think it'll be very interesting during bowl season to see how these perform, but I don't think there's any question the top of both of those leagues, meaning the Big 10 and the SEC, there are better teams at the top in both of those leagues than there are in the ACC and in the Big 12. I don't think there's a clear favorite at this point. You could say BYU, but BYU, Iowa State, and Colorado, you make those teams play in a round robin, and I think that ends up pretty close to 500 for all three of those. I don't think it's there's one that's a particular – it would be dominant over the other two, where out of the SEC, Georgia to me starting to feel like they're clearly separating themselves. It'll be interesting to see. I think Quinn, you were still a little bit banged up. How do they look against Florida this week? And then the Big Ten has become really interesting because Oregon, to me, looks like the most complete team in college football, and that win over Ohio State, looking stronger as the year goes along. But we have some fascinating matchups, and I think this playoff picture will start to become more clear in the next week or two.
Can you explain Penn State to me and why people think that they're reliable to win anything of substance?
No, other than I think Penn State fans, like all fans, you have to have that belief because that's what being a fan is. And if you're a player or a coach, you have to tell yourself that next time is going to be the time that you pull it off. But I thought that was as good an opportunity as Penn State has had maybe ever against an Ohio State team that we talk about a top 10 matchup between these two. Will Howard didn't play well. And the turnovers, especially the fumble out of the end zone and a pick six, think about those two huge plays, along with Penn State having 2 trips in the red zone, in the deep red zone, inside the 5-yard line, and you don't come away with points, much less touchdowns, and not even a field goal. James Franklin continues, and it's warranted. The criticism is warranted. I believe it's 0-7 for Penn State under James Franklin when they are a home underdog. Has not won a single time when they're playing in Happy Valley as a home underdog. That's inexcusable. And it's similar to, I think, how it's funny what Ryan Day has been dealing with Ohio State fans, where they're going 11-1, but their only loss is to Michigan, and you've got a faction of Ohio State fans saying they want to fire Ryan Day. And now it's the same thing for Penn State. They just can't get past, traditionally, Michigan or Ohio State, and that's why we've seen Penn State over and over. Feels like every year they end up number 8 or 9. They're 10-2, and I think they're by far the program that benefits the most from the expanded playoff because they still have a great path to not only getting in but hosting a playoff game. But just moving forward, there's nothing that leads me to believe that if they've got to go on the road in the playoffs, are they going to get a win? Probably not. Do I think that they're going to make a deep run in these big spots? No, probably not. And within Big Ten play, just in the years moving forward, I don't think there's any reason to believe that they get over the hump with Ohio State.
Taylor, we kind of talked about BYU there at the beginning just in terms of their seeding after last night, but they got the Holy War in Salt Lake City against the down Utah team, but both teams have had a couple weeks to get ready for this one. Any insights on your end to just the Holy War or this matchup or even maybe what you've seen from Jake Retzloff, because obviously a pretty important one out in SLC this Saturday night.
Huge game, obviously made more interesting with Cam Rising being shut down in Utah and not being what we thought they would be. But I do think it's interesting. BYU, they're still only, I think it's a 4-point favorite right now. So it's not like they're coming in as a multiple score favorite. This will be, I would liken it to like a Texas-Oklahoma, and this year didn't go that way. But usually that game in a rivalry game, it ends up being a one-score game. I think that's probably how this plays out. But this will be in the late window. Well, the entire country will be watching at least for the first period of the game. And for BYU, this is a great spot for them. We talked a little bit ago about being convincing. I mentioned that against some of the bottom teams in the Big 12. It really would matter here. If they come out and play well and they're strong against Utah and it's a convincing win, I think more and more you would see it on the East Coast and teams that are viewers that may not get to see BYU all the time. This would be a big spot for them to be able to say, well, this team's still undefeated, and even with their backup for Utah at quarterback, if BYU wins convincingly, I think that becomes more and more impressive as the season's gone along because, again, this is a team that surprised everybody. They were picked, I believe it was 11th in the media poll coming into the season in the Big 12.
Yep. There's some teams at the bottom. Arizona State has had a nice run, and the Big 12 is always just it's a guessing game at times. Taylor, what game do you have this week?
Bye week. My second bye week. So I have not been to my high school, Vista Ridge, since my last game there. So I'm going to see a high school football game Friday night, which I'm pretty fired up about.
Enjoy it. Thank you. Appreciate it. Taylor McHargue, CBS ESPN color analyst with us on Wednesdays.